So Costaway is a heavily stylized item shop game which is set on a remote island in the middle of nowhere. The game follows a pirate theme and the player's role is that of a former pirate who has wronged his old crew and must pay them back. They do this by running a successful shop, crafting items to sell and fulfilling specific orders for customers. So originally the idea was to just make a 3D environment with no gameplay loops or any kind of meaningful interactivity. So the idea behind this was to try and focus on one specific industry specialization, and this one was going to be 3D environmental art. And my thought process behind this was that spending things on time like programming and other things might not actually be beneficial for future employment. As with coding jobs, you're going to be up against people with computer science degrees, which coming as a game artist isn't a fight that you're likely to win. However, I did eventually kind of change the project and implement the game loop and just try to transition it to something else. So this is because the project felt kind of lifeless and not actually building a game or programming started to have a negative effect on my enthusiasm and the overall project momentum. Before the project began as well, I was really into this sort of crafting driven shop game with my original idea actually being a fantasy brewery. So for the game loop in this, after the transition phase, I decided to meet somewhere in the middle of both of my ideas and transitioned into a pirate item shop game. So these are kind of the overall goals that developed over the two different phases of the project. So the original goal was to always try and do the project in some sort of stylized visual style, with the Sea of Thieves one especially jumping out more and more during research. I also wanted to get my 3D skills and workflow as close to possible as industry standard, which was kind of the reasoning for my original 3D focus. But once the project shifted to a game, my prime focus became adapting the project and successfully transitioning it to a game prototype, having to work double time to implement mechanics. So for the first phase of the project, my sole focus was getting the full experience of an environmental artist, with some technical elements included, such as creating shaders within Unity or trying to simulate water in more technical programs like Houdini. Once the project became a game, however, I did begin fulfilling all the expected roles of a solo developer, such as programming, game design, etc. I did specifically exclude certain roles, however, such as character work, as having no intention of pursuing this field, I didn't really think it would be a good use of time. I always felt like because this was something I both can't do nor want to, that if I tried to implement it in the game at all, it would either take too much time or the lack of quality of it would actually bring the entire project down. Because of this, I felt like leaving the customer objects as primitives was probably the best way to show this was an element or role that I chose not to pursue rather than the alternative of looking at like I failed something, which again I feel like could bring everything else down. So for the overall art style, I eventually settled on the Sea of Thieves kind of wonky handmade style. As I said previously, the project, I was always going to do some sort of stylized assets in some way, but I found this particular style really interesting and thought it'd be a good way to kind of challenge myself to hone my 3D software skills. So for the overall art style, I followed a workflow created by Matt Wilkins, who is a rare environmental artist who posted it on ArtStation. So this detailed his general workflow and some of the tools and ZBrush brushes that he uses when creating assets. One of the more interesting parts of the workflow was that they had very explicit rules that had to be followed, such as no straight lines and everything needs to look handmade and wonky. The actual most important part of the visual style in this project actually ended up being the use of the hand-painted base texture. So this used mid-tonal values and it would be mixed with normal colors during the texturing phase and would give all of the objects a painted style. This actually gave all the objects in the game immediate consistency with each other, and the actual reusability and versatility of the base texture was pretty great, as nearly all models used it without it feeling repetitive at all. So one of the main focuses in regards to 3D was always modularity, especially during the first phase of the project while creating environmental assets. For example, creating rocks that were unique from all angles and that could be combined to create new shapes, so they could be used endlessly. General 3D workflow consisted of the more key or interesting items being brought through more parts of the pipeline, such as sculpting and retopology, with the less prevalent items skipping those phases. However, all models would be created using a base mesh first, so that if any planned object needed to change pipelines, it would be easy to do so. The vegetation utilizes plane modeling, with alphas created within Photoshop first before being compiled in Maya, then brought to Substance Painter for final texturing. For materials such as sand, it was created procedurally using Substance Designer. So once game mechanics began being implemented, they were first done so individually within isolated scenes, before being slowly mixed together. Some of the more early and basic mechanics included picking up and dropping items and the general ability to interact with objects in the scene using raycasts. One of the more challenging things to implement was the UI gaze system. So this was used to target in-game canvases, as I wanted all the interactive menus in the game to be part of the game world. So to implement this, I essentially had to treat it like a VR feature, and I had to dive into Unity's event system and kind of mesh the code together to get it to recognize each other. So it works fairly well now, and they're actually both the key components in the item delivery system and the blueprint crafting system. So one of the key mechanics is the item delivery system. So using an in-game shop canvas, players can purchase raw materials, item parts, or fully pre-made items. The actual prices for the items are marked up and down differently each day, which just needs to be implemented alongside the day-night system as of recording. When an order is complete, the objects are stored into a list and a delivery crate is spawned. When the player hits the crate, the front of it will swing open and the purchased items will shoot out one by one. The original system was going to have objects neatly organized inside, and while it was close to being done, I felt that the objects flying out was more satisfying and reminded me of games like Spyro. The original crafting system in the game was a simplistic one where raw materials or objects would simply change into something else when hit with a hammer. It would essentially cycle through a list of items to spawn when the hammer hit the object. In the new system, players specifically use a workbench in conjunction with a blueprint UI canvas to craft parts from materials. The idea of this was to make the process both more interactive and to also serve as instructions, as blueprints would show them the item parts they needed to be put together. Items were then crafted simply by dragging the item parts together, where they would then stick together, become a completed item. In regards to some of the main challenges throughout the project, one of the larger ones was the water shader in Unity. Where at one point I felt like I was fairly close to getting something decent to use, my original water shader actually became unusable, even sometimes disappearing entirely at certain angles. Unity's shader graph as well in general was a bit of a nightmare to use, mostly because of the bugs in the necessary version that we had to use, where it can freeze entirely after just naming something as simple as a variable. On top of that, I also found shader graph extremely slow to use, sometimes taking 20 to 40 seconds to respond to changes. This was on any semi-complex shader, no matter what the hardware, and when compared to other softwares, it felt kind of embarrassing to use. Getting a part-time job also had a big influence early on while adjusting to the work-life balance. Some days involved starting the day in college and finishing it in the evening after work, with no time for project work in between. This was new to me and it took some time to adjust to it. Maintaining the art style also became challenging. It can be easy to get carried away with stylized detail and forget the rules of this specific style, which I was definitely guilty of doing on occasion. Luckily, however, I think my assets remain consistent in this style, even if I did break some rules along the way. In regards to value of contribution, I feel like I managed to maintain a consistent stylized direction, both in the form of modeling and texturing throughout the project. I also feel like I successfully transitioned the project overall and managed to implement a large variety of mechanics in a short space of time, despite some of them needing some further work. I've also drastically improved my visual and technical skills, becoming very comfortable with working with stylized assets and implementing first-person mechanics. So in regards to changes, I think the first obvious change would be to make the game as a game from the very beginning of the project. Seeing what I've done in half the time kind of has my mind wondering what might have been, and will likely lead me to using my gut when it comes to any other ideas going forward. Ideally, I would have liked to spend more time on concept art and UI. I found that at certain points, not taking the time to do these actually cost me more time in the long run. Another alternative would be to work in a team setting with someone who would happily focus on these roles, while I could continue to do my own thing. Finally, I would have liked to develop some of the mechanics more. Features such as customer haggling and more interaction options were actually planned, but had to be cut towards the end just due to time constraints. So in conclusion, I'm overall pretty proud of the work I've done over the last few months. I feel like I've created some really high quality work in a large variety of areas, and it really highlights my versatility as an artist. I'm also quite happy with the result of the conversion to a game overall. I was somewhat skeptical at first at the beginning of the project, especially with having to scrap some of the original plans entirely, but the experience showed me that even large-scale iterations can be worth it. Finally, I'm fairly happy with how I've grown my skill set, specifically my 3D and programming skills. Working in such a unique art style really helped me focus on learning new tools I may not have otherwise, and the project overall showed me how important elements like programming are to me personally.